The dust of Red Hollow hung in the air like powdered blood, coating everything in sight with its peculiar rust-colored film. Calder Holt squinted against the late afternoon sun as he guided his mare down the main street, the leather of his saddle creaking with each step. At 6 feet 7 inches, he cut an imposing figure even slouched in the saddle, his broad shoulders blocking out a fair portion of the sky behind him. The town stretched before him in all its ramshackle glory, a collection of weather-beaten buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. Sunset Jack's saloon dominated the center of town, its false front reaching toward the sky like a man stretching after a long sleep. The sound of tinny piano music and raucous laughter spilled from its doors, mixing with the smell of horse sweat and dried sage that permeated everything in this part of New Mexico territory. It was 1876, and the cattle drive season had just ended. Cowboys flush with pay crowded the streets, their spurs jingling as they walked from one establishment to another. Children darted between the horses tied to hitching posts, playing some game that involved a lot of shouting and running. In the distance, Calder could hear the experimental whistle of a steam engine the railroad was testing its new line, inching ever closer to Red Hollow. He dismounted in front of the general store, his movements deliberate and careful. The weight of eyes on his back was familiar by now. It had been 3 years since he'd been branded a cattle thief. 3 years since the hot iron had seared its mark into his flesh. The scar still pulled when he moved wrong, a constant reminder of a justice system that cared more about speed than truth. "Holt!" a voice called from across the street. Sheriff Cass Merritt stood on the boardwalk outside his office, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Staying out of trouble, I hope." Calder touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, but said nothing. Words were currency in a place like Red Hollow, and he'd learned to be economical with his spending. Inside the general store, he gathered his supplies, methodically flour, coffee, ammunition for his Winchester. The proprietor, a nervous man named Elias Winters, watched him with the expression of someone handling a half-tamed wolf. "That'll be $8.30, Winters said, his voice pitched higher than normal. Calder counted out the money slowly, making sure Winters could see each coin. People got nervous when they couldn't see your hands clearly, and nervous people made mistakes. As he waited for his change, a commotion erupted from Sunset Jack's. Through the window, he saw a woman backing out of the saloon, her dark blue traveling dress dusty from the road. She held a valise in one hand and what looked like a folded document in the other. 3 men followed her out, their intentions clear in their swagger and leering grins. "Come on now, pretty lady," one of them called. He was a rat-faced fellow Calder recognized as Jake Paulson, one of Lyle Hargreaves' ranch hands. "We're just trying to be friendly-like. Show you some proper Red Hollow hospitality." The woman, she couldn't have been more than 28 or 30, kept backing away, her brown skin flushed with anger rather than fear. "I've had quite enough of your hospitality. Thank you." Her accent marked her as Eastern, probably Boston from the broad vowels. What was a Boston woman doing in Red Hollow? And alone, at that. Paulson's companion, a thick-set man with a scar across his nose, reached for her valise. "Let us help you with that heavy bag. Ma'am, woman like you shouldn't be carrying her own luggage." She jerked the valise away, but in doing so, the document in her other hand fluttered to the ground. It landed near the horses, and the wind immediately began pushing it along the dusty street. Calder was moving before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. He stepped out of the store and intercepted the paper, bending to scoop it up in one smooth motion. As his fingers closed on it, his eyes automatically scanned the contents of a surveyor's boundary map, marked with coordinates and property lines. His mind, trained by years of working on railroad crews and studying every map he could get his hands on, immediately cataloged several discrepancies in the boundary markers. "That's mine," the woman said, appearing at his elbow. Up close, he could see the determined set of her jaw and the intelligence in her dark eyes. She held out her hand expectantly. He handed it over without comment, but she must have seen something in his expression because her eyes narrowed slightly. "You can read it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Most folks can read, ma'am." "Not survey maps. Not that quickly." She folded the document carefully and tucked it into her valise. "Thank you for retrieving it." Paulson and his friends had followed, surrounding them in a loose semicircle. "Now that's real sweet," Paulson drawled. Big man Holt playing the gentleman. Didn't know branded cattle thieves had such nice manners. Calder felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the burn of old shame, but kept his expression neutral. The woman glanced between them, clearly reassessing the situation. "You boys got business here?" Calder asked quietly. "Just welcoming the lady to town." Scarface said, "Heard she's planning to set up some kind of sewing shop, maybe even teach school." He laughed unpleasantly. "Can't have unmarried women setting up shop wherever they please. It ain't proper." "I'm a widow," the woman said sharply. "And my business arrangements are none of your concern. Everything's our concern when it affects the moral fabric of our community," Paulson said, mimicking someone else's words, probably Mrs. Prudence Vale, who ran Red Hollow's unofficial moral committee with an iron fist wrapped in scripture quotations. Calder shifted slightly, a movement so small most wouldn't notice, but it put him between the woman and the men. Ladies made her position clear. "Maybe it's time you boys headed back to the ranch." "Or what?" Scarface stepped forward. "You gonna do something about it? Holt Sheriff might have something to say about a branded thief causing trouble in town." "No trouble here," Calder said mildly. "Just a man helping a lady with her dropped property. You boys are the ones making noise." For a moment, the tension stretched taut as fence wire. Then Paulson spat in the dust near Calder's boots. "This ain't over, mister. Hargreave likes to know about new arrivals in town, especially ones carrying survey maps." They sauntered away, making sure to shoulder past close enough to force the woman to step back. Calder waited until they disappeared back into the saloon before turning to her. "Name's Ruby Ansell," she said before he could speak. "And you're Calder Holt, the branded cattle thief who isn't actually a thief." He blinked, surprised by her directness. "Ma'am, I make it my business to know things. Mr. Holt, especially in a new town." She adjusted her grip on the valise. "I was a nurse's assistant in Boston, helped with record keeping. You learn to spot when stories don't add up, and yours doesn't. Most folks don't care about the particulars." "I'm not most folks." She studied him for a moment. "That map you looked at, you saw something. Didn't you? Something wrong with it?" He hesitated. Getting involved meant drawing attention, and attention was something he'd learned to avoid. But there was something about her, the way she stood straight despite the dust and heat, the way she'd faced down Paulson's crew without flinching. "Boundary markers are off," he said finally. "About 30 feet in some places, all pushing the same direction." Her eyes lit up with interest. "Toward the communal water source." Smart woman. "That'd be my guess." "Interesting." She tucked a strand of dark hair back under her bonnet. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to look at some other documents I have. I could pay you for your time." "Don't need payment, but you might want to be careful about showing those papers around. Hargreaves got a long reach." "So I'm beginning to understand." She glanced toward the saloon, then back at him. "I'm setting up shop in the old granary on 2nd Street. If you change your mind about the payment, or if you just want to look at those maps, you're welcome to stop by." She walked away before he could respond, her back straight and her step confident despite the dust swirling around her skirts. Calder watched her go, an uneasy feeling settling in his gut. Ruby Ansell was trouble, the kind of trouble that got people hurt in a town like Red Hollow. He gathered his supplies from where he'd dropped them and headed for his horse. As he loaded his saddlebags, he caught sight of Sheriff Merritt talking to Paulson outside the saloon. Their eyes turned his way, and Merritt smiled the cold smile of a man who knew he held all the cards. The wind picked up, bringing with it the smell of rain that would probably never fall. The drought had its fingers deep in the soil of Red Hollow, cracking the earth and making men desperate. Desperate men did desperate things, and a woman like Ruby Ansell, with her Eastern education and her survey maps, was walking straight into the middle of it. Calder swung into his saddle and turned his horse toward home. He had a small spread 5 miles outside town. Nothing fancy but his own. He'd learned to keep his head down, do his work, and stay clear of town politics. It was a lonely life, but it was safe. But as he rode out past the skeletal frames of new buildings going up along the railroad right-of-way, he found himself thinking about the way Ruby Ansell had looked at him not with fear or disgust, but with recognition, like she saw past the brand and the reputation to something else. He shook his head. That kind of thinking led nowhere good. He'd help her if she needed it. Maybe look at those maps if she asked again. But that was all. He couldn't afford to get tangled up in whatever she was really doing in Red Hollow. The sun was setting by the time he reached his property, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that matched the dust. As he unsaddled his horse, his back twinged, the scar tissue pulling against the movement. 3 years, and it still hurt. Some brands, he thought, never really healed. But in town, in a converted granary on 2nd Street, Ruby Ansell was unpacking her valise and making plans. And whether he knew it or not, Calder Holt was already caught in their web. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Calder spotted the cattle. They shouldn't have been there, not on communal grazing land, not bearing Hargreaves' Double H brand. He reined in his horse at the ridge overlooking Willow Creek, counting heads automatically. 40, maybe 50 head, all fat and healthy despite the drought that had everyone else's stock looking gaunt. Something wasn't right. He dismounted and ground-tied his mare, then made his way down the slope on foot. The cattle scattered lazily as he approached, and that's when he saw the brand on the nearest steer. It was Hargreaves' Double H. All right, but something about it nagged at him. He moved closer, studying the mark in the early morning light. The bottom bar of the H was thicker than the rest, and the angle was wrong. Someone had taken a different brand, looked like the rocking T from the Townsend place, and altered it. It was clever work, but Calder had spent enough time around branding irons to recognize the modification. Rustled cattle on public land. This was bigger than simple theft. This was a land grab in the making. Control the water and the grazing, and you controlled the whole valley. He was so focused on examining the altered brand that he almost missed the sound of approaching hoofbeats. By the time he looked up, Ruby Ansell was already dismounting from a sturdy bay mare, her divided riding skirt practical for the terrain. "Miss Ansell," he said, straightening. "This is a ways from town for a morning ride." "Hey, Mrs. Ansell," she corrected, though not unkindly. "And I could say the same about you, Mr. Holt, although I suspect we're here for similar reasons." She approached the steer he'd been examining, pulling a small notebook from her jacket pocket. "Altered brand?" she asked, already sketching. He nodded slowly. "You've seen this before. In Boston, not with cattle, of course, but with shipping marks on cargo. Same principle, change a few lines. And suddenly, ownership becomes very murky." She completed her sketch with quick, efficient strokes. "I've been tracking similar alterations in the town records. Property deeds with dates that don't match. Surveys that show different boundaries depending on which copy you examine." "That's a dangerous hobby, ma'am." "So is letting men like Hargreaves steal what belongs to everyone." She closed the notebook and faced him. "I knew his type back east. They dress it up prettier there, use lawyers instead of guns. But it's the same game. Take what isn't yours and dare anyone to stop you." Before Calder could respond, the thunder of approaching riders made them both turn. Sheriff Merritt led the group, with Hargreave himself beside him and 6 ranch hands spread out behind. They formed a semicircle, effectively boxing Calder and Ruby against the creek. Well, Hargreaves said, leaning forward in his saddle. He was a handsome man in his 50s, silver at his temples and expensive clothes that marked him as more businessman than rancher. Calder Holt and our mysterious Mrs. Ansel, finding you two together out here is interesting. Nothing interesting about it, Calder said evenly. Just checking the public range. Public range with my cattle on it. Hargreaves said, Sheriff, I believe we discussed what happens to people who interfere with private property. Merritt shifted in his saddle, his hand resting casually near his pistol. That we did. Course, finding an unmarried woman out here alone with a man of questionable reputation. Well, that raises other concerns. I told you, I'm a widow, Ruby said sharply. So you say, Hargreaves smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Funny thing, though, we sent a telegram to Boston. No record of any Ansel family matching your description. Makes a man wonder what else you might be lying about. Ruby's face didn't change, but Calder saw her hands tighten on her notebook. Perhaps you telegraphed the wrong office. Boston's a large city. Perhaps. Hargreaves' gaze shifted between them. Or perhaps you're not who you claim to be. A woman traveling alone, carrying survey maps, asking questions about property boundaries. Some might call that suspicious behavior. Some might call Altered Brands suspicious too, Calder said quietly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Hargreaves' smile vanished, and several of the ranch hands shifted their hands toward their weapons. That's a serious accusation. Holt, Merritt said. The kind that could land a man in trouble, especially a man who's already been branded a thief once. No accusation, Calder said, just observation. Here's what I observe, Hargreaves said. I see two people who've been stirring up trouble since the moment they met. Bad for the town's moral character, bad for business. Sheriff, I think we need to consider what's best for Red Hollow. Merritt nodded slowly. The town council's been discussing the matter. Can't have unmarried individuals creating scandal. Sets a bad example for the young folks. I've done nothing scandalous, Ruby protested. Haven't you, Mrs.? Prudence Vale emerged from behind the riders, sitting primly on a buggy driven by her nephew. How long had she been waiting there? A woman claiming to be widowed, with no proof, setting up shop near the saloons and train depot. And now we'd find you out here, unchaperoned, with a man. We happen to be examining the same public land. The appearance of impropriety is as damaging as impropriety itself. Mrs. Vale interrupted. However, there is a solution that would satisfy everyone's concerns. Calder felt the trap closing before she even spoke the words. Marriage, Mrs. Vale announced. If you two are so keen on spending time together, let it be within the bounds of Christian matrimony. It would solve the question of Mrs. Ansel's respectability and provide proper oversight for Mr. Holt's tendencies. That's absurd, Ruby said. Is it? Hargreaves leaned back in his saddle, clearly enjoying himself. Seems like a neat solution to me, unless, of course, you'd prefer to leave town, both of you. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Leave town, and whatever Ruby was investigating would die with her departure. Stay, and face continued harassment or worse. Calder had seen this play before, had watched Hargreaves and Merritt squeeze out smaller ranchers and homesteaders with similar tactics. I need time to consider, Ruby said finally. Of course. Hargreaves' smile returned. Shall we say, 3 days the circuit preacher will be through then. Perfect timing for a wedding, or for packing. They wheeled their horses and rode off, leaving dust and the echo of hoofbeats behind. Mrs. Vale's buggy followed, but not before she cast a disapproving glance at Ruby's riding attire. When they were gone, Ruby sank onto a nearby rock, her composure finally cracking. Marriage, she said, half laughing. As if I came all this way to be trapped in another cage. You don't have to stay, Calder said, Whatever you're really here for, it isn't worth. My brother is worth it. The words came out fierce and sudden. She looked up at him, vulnerability flickering across her features before she mastered it. My brother Noah. He was working with a railroad survey team 6 months ago. His letter stopped coming. The railroad says he never worked for them, but I have his pay stubs. He mentioned Red Hollow in his last letter, said something about boundary disputes and false surveys. Calder absorbed this information, pieces clicking into place. You think Hargreave had something to do with his disappearance? I think Hargreave has something to do with a lot of disappearances. Small ranchers who sell out suddenly and leave in the night. Homesteaders whose claims get challenged and lost. And now my brother. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. So yes, I'll stay, but I won't be forced into a marriage for their convenience. There might be another way. Calder heard himself saying, a marriage that satisfies their requirements but on our terms. She studied him, those intelligent eyes searching his face. Go on. Legal marriage, but a business arrangement. You get protection and access to records at the courthouse. A married woman has different standing than a single one. I get. He paused, not sure how to articulate what he'd gain. A chance to fight back against the men who'd branded him. A purpose beyond mere survival. You get a partner in finding the truth. Ruby finished. Someone who believes you were framed. The word partner lodged somewhere in his chest, warm and unfamiliar. We'd need terms, she said, already thinking it through. Written agreement, separate quarters, equal say in decisions. And when it's over, annulment, quiet departure, whatever makes sense. She held out her hand like a man would, to shake on a business deal. Partners. He looked at her outstretched hand. This woman who'd come to Red Hollow with her notebooks and her fierce determination. Taking it meant stepping out of the shadows he'd hidden in for 3 years. It meant risk and exposure and all the things he'd learned to avoid. He took her hand anyway. Partners, he agreed. They worked out the details as they rode back toward town, keeping a respectable distance between their horses. Ruby would draw up a private agreement that night. They'd marry in 3 days as demanded, but it would be their choice, their terms, a mutual defense against Hargreave's machinations. One more thing, Ruby said as the town came into view. That altered brand, you're certain about what you saw? Dead certain. The Townsends lost their ranch last year. Said they couldn't prove their cattle were theirs when they started showing up with different brands. Everyone thought they were lying. But they weren't. Ruby's jaw set with determination. We'll need proof, documentation, witnesses. We'll need to be careful. Hargreave didn't build his empire by letting people challenge him. No, Ruby agreed. But he also didn't count on us. As they parted ways at the edge of town, maintaining appearances, already Calder found himself thinking that Hargreave might not be the only one who'd underestimated Ruby Ansell. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell and watched her ride toward her shop, back straight and purpose in every line of her body. 3 days until a wedding neither of them wanted but both had chosen. 3 days to prepare for a partnership that would either expose the truth or destroy them both. He turned his horse toward home, the morning's revelations weighing heavy in his mind. The altered brands were just the beginning. The question was, how far did the corruption go, and how many people would they have to fight to expose it? Behind him, unnoticed, one of Hargreave's men watched from the shadow of the livery stable, then slipped away to report what he'd seen. The game was in motion now, and every player would have to choose their moves carefully. In her shop, Ruby Ansell bent over her sewing machine, but her mind was on legal documents and marriage contracts. She'd sworn after her husband's death that she'd never let another man control her life. This arrangement with Calder Holt would be different, a meeting of equals, a sharing of purpose rather than a surrender of self. At least, that's what she told herself as she began to draft their private agreement, her neat handwriting filling the pages of her ledger. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Red Hollow, and the dust continued its eternal dance in the streets. The converted granary on 2nd Street had transformed in the week since the wedding. What had been a dusty storage building now hummed with life. Ruby's sewing machine occupied one corner. Bolts of fabric-lined makeshift shelves. And, most surprisingly, a dozen children sat cross-legged on the floor, watching Calder demonstrate measurements with a piece of rope. "Now, if one stride is about 3 feet, he said, stretching the rope between his hands. "How many strides would it take to walk from here to the water pump?" Little Tommy Martinez, all of 7 years old with a gap-toothed grin, shot his hand up. 20. "Let's find out." Calder handed him the rope. "Count your steps, but remember your strides shorter than mine." The children scrambled to follow Tommy outside, their excited chatter filling the air. Ruby looked up from her sewing, a smile tugging at her lips. Their marriage might be a business arrangement, but watching Calder with the children revealed a gentleness that the rest of Red Hollow never saw. "They adore you," she said when he returned, the children still outside practicing their measurements. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. "It's practical knowledge. Might help them someday." "Everything's practical with you, isn't it?" She set aside the shirt she was mending. "Even kindness has to have a purpose." Before he could respond, the door burst open. Maria Santos stood there, her 5-year-old daughter Isabella clutched to her chest, blood seeping through the child's dress. "Please," Maria gasped. "She fell from the horse. The doctor, won't he said we can't—" "Bring her here," Ruby commanded, immediately clearing her cutting table. Her entire demeanor shifted, the competent nurse emerging. "Calder, I need hot water and clean cloth. My medical supplies are in the blue case." Calder moved without question, grateful for clear instructions. As he heated water on the small stove, he could hear Ruby's calm voice assessing the injury, keeping both mother and child calm. This was why the poor families had started coming to her not just for sewing or letters, but for the medical knowledge she dispensed without judgment or demand for payment. "It's not as bad as it looks," Ruby announced. "The cut's clean but shallow. Head wounds bleed dramatically, but she'll be fine." As she worked, cleaning and bandaging the wound with efficient movements, Calder noticed Sheriff Merritt watching from across the street. The man's expression was unreadable, but his presence meant trouble. Sure enough, an hour after the Santos family left with profuse thanks and a small doll Ruby had quickly sewn for Isabella, Mrs. Prudence Vale arrived with her committee. "Mrs. Holt," she began, using Ruby's married name like a weapon. "We've had complaints." "About what, exactly?" Ruby didn't look up from her sewing machine. "Unsuitable activities, gathering children without proper oversight, practicing medicine without qualification, creating disruption in our community's natural order." "I'm teaching children to read and count," Ruby said evenly. "And I was a certified nurse's assistant in Boston. Would you prefer I let Isabella Santos bleed?" "The Santos family has their own kind to turn to," Mrs. Vale sniffed. "As do the others you've been encouraging. It sets a dangerous precedent when people forget their place." Calder stepped forward, but Ruby's slight gesture stopped him. This was her battle to fight. "Their place," Ruby repeated slowly. "And what place would that be?" "Mrs. Vale." "You know perfectly well what I mean. There's an order to things. The Mexican families, the freedmen, the Indian workers from the railroad, they have their section of town. We have ours. Mixing causes nothing but trouble." "I see." Ruby finally looked up, her dark eyes steady. "And which section do I belong to, Mrs. Vale?" "My grandmother was Cherokee. My late husband was Irish. My skin marks me as neither Mexican nor white by your standards. So where, exactly, is my place?" The committee members shifted uncomfortably. They'd assumed Ruby was Italian or Portuguese, perhaps foreign but acceptably European. This revelation changed things in their rigid worldview. Mrs. Vale recovered first. You're married to Mr. Holt now. That settles your position. But it doesn't excuse encouraging unnatural mingling. Mr. Hargreave has expressed concern about the influence on property values. Of course he has, Calder muttered. What was that, Mr. Holt? I said. Of course he has. Educated workers might ask for fair wages. Families who can read might understand their land rights. Children who can measure and calculate might notice when boundary markers move in the night. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Mrs. Vale's face flushed. Are you suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything, Calder said. Just observing that Mr. Hargreave seems mighty concerned about poor folks learning their letters. The school will continue. Ruby added firmly. Unless the town council wishes to officially bar education for certain citizens, I'm sure the territorial government would find that interesting, especially with statehood discussions underway. It was a calculated threat. New Mexico's bid for statehood was contentious, with Congress concerned about the territory's ability to govern fairly. Any hint of official discrimination could damage those chances. Mrs. Vale gathered her dignity like armor. We'll be watching Mrs. Holt one step out of line. She let the threat dangle and swept out, her committee trailing behind. When they were gone, Ruby sagged slightly. Thank you for backing me. Partners. Remember? Calder moved to the window, watching the committee disperse. But they're not wrong about the danger. Hargreave won't tolerate this for long. Then we'd better work faster. Ruby opened a drawer and pulled out a leather journal. I've been mapping the boundary changes you showed me. Look at this. She spread out several hand-drawn maps, each showing property lines at different dates. The progression was clear public land slowly being absorbed, boundaries creeping toward water sources, small holdings disappearing into larger ones. It's systematic, Calder said, tracing the changes with one finger. But how is he getting away with it? The land office is run by Hargreave's cousin. Ruby finished. I found that out yesterday. And the surveyor who certifies the claims on Hargreave's payroll. So even if we prove the boundaries are false, we need federal intervention, which means evidence so clear that even corrupt local officials can't ignore it. She pulled out another paper. Which brings me to this. Calder recognized it immediately. A railroad shipping manifest. His pulse quickened. Where did you get this? Isabella's father works at the depot. He was grateful for the medical help. She pointed to specific entries. Look at the dates. Building supplies shipped to Hargreaves' ranch on the same nights you mentioned seeing crews out by the boundary markers. They're moving the markers under cover of darkness, using railroad supplies. Calder studied the manifest more closely. But this alone isn't enough. No, but it's a start. And there's something else. Ruby hesitated, then pulled out a worn photograph. This is Noah, my brother. Calder studied the image, a young man with Ruby's intelligent eyes and determined jaw, standing beside a surveying tripod. He looks like you. He was always the smart one. Got a scholarship to study engineering, learned surveying to pay for books. Her voice caught slightly. His last letter mentioned discrepancies in the official surveys around Red Hollow. 2 weeks later, he vanished. You think Hargreave? I think Noah found what we're finding and wasn't careful enough about it. She tucked the photograph away. That's why we have to be smarter. A knock at the door interrupted them. Calder's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol, but Ruby was already opening it. Tommy Martinez stood there, eyes wide with excitement. Mrs. Ruby Mister. Calder. We measured all the way to the church and back, 47 of my strides, but only 32 of Jose's 'cause he's got longer legs. Despite the tension, Ruby smiled. That's excellent work. Tommy, did you write it down? Yes, ma'am. He proudly displayed a scrap of paper with crooked numbers. And we figured out that the new fence Mr. Hargreaves' men put up is 20 strides past where the old one was. Calder and Ruby exchanged glances from the mouths of babes. "Tommy," Calder said carefully, "can you show me exactly where you measured?" For the next hour, they followed the children's enthusiastic tour of their measurements. What emerged was a map more detailed than any surveyors. The children had unconsciously documented every recent change in the town's boundaries, every new fence and moved marker, simply through their play. "We need to write this all down," Ruby said quietly to Calder. "Their observations could be crucial." But as they returned to the shop, they found Sheriff Merritt waiting, badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Mrs. Holt," he said, touching his hat mockingly. "I'm afraid we've had a complaint. Seems someone's been encouraging children to trespass on private property." "They were measuring public streets," Ruby protested. "Were they funny how Mr. Hargreaves' property line seems to have expanded to include those streets, according to the official survey, filed just this morning." He produced a document with an official seal. "So I'll have to ask you to keep those children from trespassing again. Would hate for anyone to get hurt." The threat was clear. Ruby's hands clenched, but she nodded tightly. "Of course, Sheriff. We certainly wouldn't want anyone hurt." After Merritt left, whistling tunelessly, Calder touched Ruby's shoulder. "He's escalating. This is going to get worse before it gets better." "I know." She looked at the children still playing outside, at the women gathering for the afternoon sewing circle, at the life she'd built in this converted granary. "But we can't stop now. Too many people are counting on us." That evening, as they worked side by side, Ruby teaching letters to a group of miners' children, while Calder showed their fathers how to calculate fair wages based on ore weight, the converted granary felt like more than a school. It felt like the heart of something larger, something Hargreave and his allies had good reason to fear. Change was coming to Red Hollow, one measured stride and carefully formed letter at a time. The only question was whether they could survive long enough to see it through. As the last student left and Ruby began banking the stove for the night, Calder found himself watching her, this fierce, brilliant woman who'd upended his careful, solitary existence. Their marriage might be business, but the partnership had become something real. "What?" she asked, noticing his stare. "Nothing, just thinking we make a good team." She smiled, the expression transforming her tired face. "We do, don't we? Who would have thought a branded thief and a Boston widow could cause so much trouble?" "The best kind of trouble," he agreed. Outside, the stars began their nightly vigil over Red Hollow, and in the shadows, Hargreaves' men watched and waited, planning their next move in a game whose stakes grew higher with each passing day. The storm caught them 20 miles from town, in the narrow passage of Dry Ribbon Canyon where the walls rose like prison bars against the darkening sky. They'd been trailing a wagon loaded with suspicious timber, the kind used for survey markers, when the clouds rolled in fast and black as spilled ink. "We need to find shelter," Calder shouted over the rising wind, pulling his hat low against the first fat drops of rain. Ruby nodded, water already streaming down her face. They'd been married 3 weeks now, maintaining careful boundaries in their business arrangement, but nature cared nothing for human proprieties. The rain came in sheets, turning the canyon floor into a rushing stream within minutes. Calder spotted an overhang in the rock face, barely visible through the downpour. He grabbed Ruby's horse's reins, leading both animals toward the meager shelter. By the time they crowded under the ledge, they were soaked through, shivering in the sudden cold. "The horses," Ruby said through chattering teeth. "They'll manage better than us," Calder replied. But he hobbled them close and loosened their cinches. His hands were numb with cold as he untied his bedroll from behind the saddle. The canvas was damp, but not soaked through. "We need a fire," he said, already gathering what dry wood he could find pushed back under the overhang. "You'll catch pneumonia in those wet clothes." Ruby hugged herself, practical sense warring with modesty. "I can manage." "No, you can't," His voice was firm, but not unkind. "I've seen men die from exposure out here. Pride isn't worth your life." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. While he coaxed flames from the damp kindling, she moved to the far side of their small shelter, using the canvas as a screen while she wrung out her clothes and wrapped herself in the slightly drier blanket from her saddlebags. The fire caught slowly, smoking before finally blooming into real warmth. Calder fed it carefully, aware of their limited fuel. When he turned back, Ruby had settled near the flames, the blanket wrapped around her like armor, her dark hair loose and drying in waves. "Your turn," she said quietly. "I promise not to look." He changed quickly, efficiently, hanging their wet clothes on rocks near the fire, when he joined her by the flames, wrapped in his own damp blanket. An awkward silence settled between them. The storm raged outside their small circle of light, cutting them off from the world. "Tell me about him," Calder said finally. "Your brother." Ruby's face softened. "Noah is brilliant. Could look at any machine and understand how it worked. When we were children in Boston, he'd take apart clocks just to see their insides, then put them back together better than before." She smiled at the memory. "He taught me to read using railroad timetables because he said they were more interesting than primers." Sounds like someone who'd noticed surveying irregularities. "Exactly." Her smile faded. "He wrote that he'd found something important, something about water rights and false claims. Said he was gathering proof to take to the federal marshals. Then, nothing." Calder added another stick to the fire. "How long since his last letter?" 6 months. The railroad said he never worked for them, but I have his pay stubs, his letters on their stationery." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I went to the law in Boston first. They said without a body, without proof of foul play, there was nothing they could do, so I came here." "Alone? To a place where you had no friends, no protection?" "I had my wits and my determination. Sometimes that has to be enough." She looked at him across the fire. "What about you? What drives a man to live in shadows for 3 years, branded as something he's not?" Calder stared into the flames, old pain flickering across his features. "You really want to know?" "We're partners. I should know what I'm fighting alongside." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "I worked for the railroad, laying track through the territories. Good money, honest work. The crew boss, man named Garrison, was skimming wages, charging the company for full crews while paying us half. When men complained, accidents happened. A lot of accidents." Ruby leaned forward, drawn by the pain in his voice. "I kept records," he continued. "Taught myself accounting from books, documented everything. Was planning to take it to the territorial governor. But Garrison found out. Next thing I knew, I was accused of stealing cattle from the company herd. They had witnesses. Even had one of my gloves near the butchered animals. A frame-up. Complete and thorough. The trial was a joke. Judge was Garrison's cousin. They branded me right there in the courtroom. Said I was lucky they didn't hang me." His hand moved unconsciously toward his back. "Garrison died 2 years later in a saloon fight. The truth died with him." "I'm sorry," Ruby said softly. "That kind of injustice, it eats at a person." "Every day." He met her eyes. "Until 3 weeks ago, when a certain Boston widow showed up asking questions everyone else was too scared to ask. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. I meant what I said that day," Ruby said quietly. "About believing you were framed. Your story never added up. A man who steals cattle doesn't spend his evenings teaching himself to read survey maps and calculate land measurements. How did you?" I asked around, quietly. "The owner of the bookstore remembers you buying every manual on surveying and land rights he could order. Said you paid in advance. Always. She smiled slightly. Cattle thieves don't usually invest in education. Something shifted in the air between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Calder found himself studying her face in the firelight, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she held herself with dignity, even wrapped in a rough blanket. "This is dangerous," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure if he meant their investigation or this moment. "Everything worth doing is dangerous." Ruby replied. She shifted closer to the fire, closer to him. "My grandmother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it." Smart woman. She taught me herbs and healing when the doctors wouldn't treat Cherokee people. Taught me to read the stars and the seasons. Ruby's voice grew soft. She would have liked you. She appreciated people who fought for truth. Thunder crashed overhead, making them both jump. Lightning illuminated the canyon for a brilliant second, showing the water rushing past their shelter. They were well and truly trapped until morning. "We should sleep in shifts," Calder said, trying to restore some distance. "Keep the fire going. Or we could just talk." Ruby suggested, "Tell me about the maps you've been studying. What patterns do you see?" So he did, grateful for the safe topic. They spent hours discussing land grants and water rights, the systematic way Hargreave was expanding his holdings, the connections to the railroad that seemed to run deeper than simple supply contracts. Ruby shared her own findings, shipping manifests that didn't match, payments to surveyors who filed reports without ever visiting the properties they certified. "It's bigger than just Red Hollow," she said as the night wore on. "I think it's happening all along the railroad route. Control the land, control the water, control the shipping. Control everything." Calder finished. "And anyone who notices or objects disappears, like Noah." Her voice broke slightly on her brother's name. Without thinking, Calder reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. "We'll find out what happened to him," he promised. "And we'll stop Hargreave. Together." "Together." She squeezed his hand, then looked up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "You know, for a business arrangement, this feels—" "I know." The fire had burned low, casting them in intimate shadows. Rain still fell outside, but softer now, a gentle patter rather than a roar. Ruby shivered despite the warmth. And Calder made a decision that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the woman beside him. "Come here," he said softly, opening his blanket in invitation. She hesitated only a moment before moving into the circle of his arm, maintaining a careful inch of space between them even as they shared warmth. Her hair smelled of rain and lavender soap. "They branded him with the sweetest bride," Ruby whispered, so soft he almost missed it. Her first night fire bound his soul to her forever. "What?" She tilted her head to look up at him. "Something my grandmother used to say about arranged marriages that became love matches, that the fire of the first night together could bind souls, if both were willing." She smiled sadly. Of course, she meant actual wedding nights, not being trapped by storms while investigating land fraud. "Ruby," his voice was rough. "I know, business arrangement, I remember." But her hand found his again under the blanket. "Though I'm beginning to think we're both very bad at business." He couldn't help but laugh, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. "The worst!" "What happens when this is over?" she asked. "When we've exposed Hargreave and found Noah, do we just dissolve the partnership? Is that what you want?" "I asked you first." He was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain and feeling the warmth of her beside him. "No," he said finally. "That's not what I want." "Good," she whispered, "because I've become rather fond of my business partner." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, gentle and chaste, but full of promise. "As have I." They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned lower, neither willing to break the spell of the moment. Eventually, Exhaustion claimed them, and they slept sitting up, leaning against each other while the storm passed overhead. Dawn came with the sound of horses' hooves on wet rock. Calder woke instantly, hand going to his pistol, but the riders were already visible, 4 men wearing the Double H brand, led by Jake Paulson. Well, well, Paulson drawled, taking in their obvious state of having spent the night together. Mister, Hargreaves going to be real interested to hear about this. About what? Ruby asked coolly, though her clothes were still drying by the dead fire and her hair was loose around her shoulders. 2 people taking shelter from a storm. That what you call it? One of the other men laughed unpleasantly. Looked mighty cozy from where we're sitting. Calder stood slowly, deliberately, using his full height. You boys got business in this canyon? Matter of fact, we do. Paulson gestured to the wagon tracks, still visible despite the rain. Looking for some missing property. Timber wagon went missing last night. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Can't say that we do, Calder replied evenly. Funny, because we tracked it this far before the rain hit. Paulson's eyes glittered dangerously, almost like someone was following it. Lots of wagons use this canyon, Ruby said. It's the only pass for 20 miles. True enough. Paulson wheeled his horse around. You folks have a safe trip back to town, and Mrs. Holt, you might want to pin that hair up. Wouldn't want people getting the wrong idea about what kind of woman you are. They waited until the riders were gone before breaking camp. As they saddled their horses, Ruby noticed something glinting in the mud, a metal tag, the kind used to mark shipping crates. Calder, look at this. He took the tag, reading the stamped numbers. Railroad property mark, recent. From their wagon. Ruby's eyes lit up. Evidence that they're using railroad materials for their scheme. One piece of evidence, we'll need more. Then we'd better get back to work. She swung into her saddle with practiced ease, then looked down at him. What we talked about last night doesn't leave this canyon if you don't want it to, he assured her. That's not what She paused, then smiled. We'll talk about it later, when Hargreaves not breathing down our necks. As they rode back toward Red Hollow, the sun breaking through the remaining clouds, Calder found himself thinking about fires and binding and the way she'd whispered against his shoulder in the night. Their business arrangement was becoming something neither of them had planned for, something that could be wonderful or dangerous or both. Behind them, unnoticed, fresh wagon tracks led deeper into the canyon toward a cache of timber and surveying equipment that would soon mark new boundaries on old land. The game was entering its final phase, and every player would soon have to show their cards. But for now, in the morning light with the storm past and the woman he was coming to love riding beside him, Calder allowed himself a moment of hope. They would finish this. They would find justice. And maybe, just maybe, they would find something more along the way. The dust storm rose from the west like a brown wall of judgment, blotting out the afternoon sun and turning the air thick as wool. But it wasn't the storm that sent ice through Calder's veins. It was the orange glow flickering beneath it. Fire! The cry went up from the church tower where young Miguel Santos kept watch. Fire on the grasslands. Calder was already moving, grabbing his lariat and swinging onto his horse. Ruby appeared from the schoolhouse, her students scattering behind her like startled quail. Get the women and children to the church, he shouted over the rising wind. Stone walls won't burn. What about the cattle? Ruby called back, but he was already galloping toward the smoke. The scene that greeted him on the open range was chaos, driven by the wind. Flames raced across the drought-dry grass faster than a horse could run, and directly in its path, a massive herd of cattle milled in panic, at least 200 head bearing various brands, including Hargreaves' Double H. But it was the direction they were headed that made Calder's blood run cold. Stampede, straight toward town. Yay-haw! The shout came from his left, and he saw Tom Brennan and 3 other cowboys trying to turn the herd's leaders. But the smoke and flames had the cattle wild with terror, and they weren't responding to the usual methods. Calder didn't hesitate. He spurred his mare forward, uncoiling his rope as he rode. The trick wasn't to stop a stampede that was impossible. The trick was to turn it, to get the leaders running in a circle until the momentum died. He swept past the edge of the herd, his horse's hooves pounding in rhythm with his heart. The lead steer was a massive longhorn, eyes rolling white with fear. Calder's loop sailed through the smoky air, settling neat around those spreading horns. The jolt nearly pulled him from the saddle, but he held on, using his horse's weight to pull the steer's head to the right. Slowly, agonizingly, the beast began to turn. That's it. Tom Brennan appeared beside him, adding his rope to another leader. Keep them turning. Other cowboys joined in, and gradually the stampede began to curve away from town. But the fire wasn't done with them yet. A shift in the wind sent flames leaping across a dry creek bed, cutting off their escape route. "We're trapped," someone shouted. "No," Calder said grimly. "We go through." It was madness driving cattle toward fire instead of away from it. But beyond that line of flames lay the wide wash of Bitter Creek, where the lack of vegetation would stop the fire's spread. They just had to get there. "Stay tight," he yelled. "Don't let them scatter." They plunged into the smoke, men and cattle together. The heat was overwhelming, the air thick with ash and terror. Calder's eyes streamed tears as he rode, trusting his horse to find her footing when he could barely see. Then they were through, bursting out of the smoke into the relative clear of the wash. The cattle, finding themselves on open ground with the fire behind them, finally began to slow. "Head count," Calder called, coughing to clear his lungs. "All here," Tom reported, grinning through a mask of soot. "Every last cowboy accounted for. That was some riding. Halt." But Calder was already turning back toward town, where new smoke was rising. "The fire's jumped the creek. It's heading for the settlement." They rode hard, arriving to find Ruby had transformed the schoolhouse into a firefighting headquarters. Women and children formed bucket brigades while the older boys cleared a fire break around the building. "The wind's pushing it toward the granary," Ruby called out, her face streaked with ash. "If we lose that, we lose the school, the seed stores, everything." Calder's mind raced. They didn't have enough water, didn't have enough hands. But then his eyes landed on old Thomas, the keeper of the communal well, and an idea struck. "Thomas, can we divert the irrigation channel?" The old man's eyes widened with understanding. "The emergency gate haven't opened it in 10 years, but it might work." "Do it." Calder turned to the others. "Everyone who can swing a shovel. With me, we're going to cut a channel from the irrigation ditch to flood the ground between the fire and the town." It was desperate work. The fire advanced like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. Men who'd never worked together, cowboys, miners, even some of Hargreaves' hands labored side by side, throwing dirt and cutting channels. "It's working!" someone shouted as water began to flow into their makeshift moat. But old Thomas, struggling with the rusted gate mechanism, suddenly cried out. The handle had snapped, and the gate was only partially open. "I'll hold it," the old man shouted, gripping the broken mechanism. "Get everyone clear." "Thomas, no," Ruby started forward, but Calder caught her arm. "He knows what he's doing," he said quietly, though his heart was heavy. Old Thomas held that gate until the last possible moment, until the water had created a barrier the fire couldn't cross. When he finally stumbled away, his hands were burned raw and his breathing labored from smoke. "Get him to the church," Ruby ordered, immediately taking charge of his care. "Cold water for the burns. Keep him breathing clear." The fire, robbed of fuel by their fire break and water barrier, began to die. As the sun set through the smoky haze, Red Hollow still stood. But their relief was short-lived. Sheriff Merritt appeared, still clean despite the chaos. with an unpleasant smile on his face. "Quite the hero, aren't you?" "Holt," he said. "Funny thing, though, we found this near where the fire started." He held up a knife, Calder's knife, the one he'd lost 2 days prior. "That's not," Calder began, but Merritt cut him off. "Several witnesses saw you out that way this morning, and everyone knows you've got a grudge against Mr. Hargreave, whose cattle were put at risk by this fire." "That's ridiculous." Ruby stepped forward, fierce despite her exhaustion. "Calder saved those cattle, saved the town." After starting the fire to make himself look good, Merritt shook his head. "I've seen it before. Man wants to play hero, so he creates a crisis to solve." "Sheriff," Tom Brennan spoke up, "that don't make no sense. Holt nearly died turning that stampede." "Maybe he miscalculated. Fire got away from him." Merritt's hand rested on his pistol. "I'm placing you under arrest. Holt, we'll let the judge sort it out." "Wait." Ruby dug in her pocket, producing something that glinted in the fading light. "Before you arrest anyone, Sheriff, perhaps you'd like to explain this." It was the railroad shipping tag from the canyon, but she held it like a weapon. "I don't know what. It's from a shipment of tar pitch. Highly flammable tar pitch, shipped to Hargreaves' ranch 3 nights ago. The same tar pitch that witnesses saw being loaded onto wagons heading toward the grasslands this morning." Her voice was steady, dangerous. The same tar pitch that would ensure a fire spread quickly in a specific direction toward the communal grazing lands. The crowd that had gathered murmured uneasily. Several of Hargreaves' own cowboys looked troubled. "You can't prove," Merritt began. "Actually, I can." Ruby produced a paper from her other pocket. "Signed testimony from the freight clerk at the depot. He was very helpful once I mentioned that falsifying shipping records is a federal offense." Merritt's face had gone pale. "Now, let's not be hasty." "The only haste here," Calder said quietly, "is your rush to frame an innocent man again." The standoff stretched taut as wire. Then, from the crowd, a voice spoke up. "I saw them wagons. It was Ed Harper, one of Hargreaves' cowboys. Didn't think nothing of it at the time, but they were heading toward where the fire started. Had tar smell something awful." "Ed," Merritt warned, "you don't know what you're saying. I know I'm tired of this." Ed stepped forward. "Tired of moving boundary markers in the night. Tired of watching good people get pushed off their land. That old man nearly died today saving this town. I'm done keeping quiet." More voices joined his cowboys. Townspeople, even some of Hargreaves' men. Stories of intimidation, of forced sales, of surveys that changed overnight. The dam of fear had finally broken. Merritt's hand tightened on his pistol, but he was vastly outnumbered. "This isn't over," he snarled, backing away. "Mister, Hargreave has powerful friends. You'll all regret this." He retreated into the night, leaving behind a town that had finally found its voice. As people dispersed to tend wounds and assess damage, Ruby found Calder standing alone, staring at the smoldering grassland. "Old Thomas?" he asked quietly. "He'll live. His hands will heal, though he may not have full use of them again." She touched his arm gently. "He says it was worth it." "Was it? We saved the town, but Hargreaves still owns half of it. We have testimony, but will it be enough?" "It's a start." She showed him another paper, a telegram form. "I sent word to the federal marshal's office. With Ed Harper and the others willing to testify, we might finally get outside intervention." Calder pulled her close, not caring who might see. She smelled of smoke and sweat and courage. "You were magnificent today." "We both were." She rested her head against his chest. "Partners. Remember?" "More than partners," he said softly, and felt her smile against his shirt. Later that night, as they helped distribute food and water to those fighting spot fires, Calder noticed something that gave him hope. Cowboys who worked for different brands were sharing equipment, Mexican families and Anglo families worked side by side. The artificial divisions Hargreave and his allies had fostered were crumbling in the face of shared adversity. "Change is coming," Ruby said, following his gaze. "About time," he replied. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Hargreave wouldn't give up easily, and they still had to prove their case to federal authorities. Noah was still missing. The fight was far from over. But tonight, as Red Hollow pulled together to heal its wounds, Calder allowed himself to believe they might actually win. The fire that had threatened to destroy them had instead forged them into something stronger, a community that would no longer be divided and conquered. In the distance, a light rain began to fall, not enough to end the drought, but enough to finish killing the fires and settle the dust. It felt like a blessing, like the sky itself was washing Red Hollow clean for whatever came next. The abandoned blacksmith shop on the edge of town hadn't seen honest work in 2 years, but in the pre-dawn darkness, Calder Holt was making it ring with purpose. The forge glowed cherry red as he worked, sweat streaming down his face despite the cool morning air. "Easy," Ruby murmured from where she kept watch at the window. "You'll wake the whole town." "Need them perfect," Calder replied, not looking up from his work. In his hands, a branding iron was taking shape, an exact replica of the altered brands they'd discovered. If we're going to prove how Hargreave's been changing marks, we need to show the technique. For the past week, they'd been gathering evidence with the methodical patience of hunters. Ed Harper's testimony had opened floodgates, and more cowboys had come forward with stories of midnight brand-altering expeditions. Ruby had compiled everything in her neat hand dates, locations, cattle counts that didn't match official records. "Someone's coming," Ruby warned softly. But it was only Tom Brennan, slipping through the door with a canvas sack. "Got what you asked for," he said, producing several original branding irons from various ranches. "Had to dig the rocking T out of Townsend's old place. Family left it when they fled." "Perfect." Calder compared the iron to his replica. "See, this original rocking T has a curved base. Add a straight iron here, and it becomes the bar of an H." Tom finished, understanding dawning. "Then heat it again. Add another mark. Double H, Hargreaves brand." Calder demonstrated with quick, precise movements. "Takes skill, but a good hand can do it in minutes." Ruby was already sketching the progression in her notebook. This is what we needed. Visual proof that anyone can understand. The barbecue and auction was Hargreaves' annual show of power, a celebration of his success that the whole county attended. This year, with tensions running high after the fire, he'd made it bigger than ever, a demonstration that he remained untouchable. 3 days, Ruby said. The federal marshal confirmed he'll be there, posing as a cattle buyer from Denver. If we can present our evidence publicly, with him as witness. Hargreave can't make it disappear. Calder finished. But he'll be expecting something. Man like him doesn't survive this long without being cautious. Then we'll have to be more careful. Ruby tucked her notebook away. "I've arranged for copies of all our evidence to be sent to the newspaper in Santa Fe. If something happens to us." "Nothing's going to happen to you." The words came out fiercer than Calder intended. She smiled, touching his soot-stained hand. "To us, nothing's going to happen to us." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Ruby worked with the women to create a detailed ledger of altered brands, missing cattle, and changed property lines. Calder met secretly with ranchers who'd lost land, piecing together the full scope of Hargreaves' empire. On the morning of the barbecue, Red Hollow buzzed with activity. Hargreave had spared no expense, imported a band from El Paso, brought in prize beef, even hired a photographer to document his generosity. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that most of the beef bore recently altered brands. "Remember," Ruby said as they dressed in their best clothes, "we wait for the marshal's signal. A red handkerchief in his pocket means he's ready." Calder adjusted his string tie, uncomfortable in the formal wear. "And if something goes wrong..." Then we improvise. She pinned her hair up carefully, concealing several documents in the elaborate style. We've come too far to stop now. The barbecue was held on Hargreaves' expanded estate, the grounds decorated with bunting and flags. The man himself held court near the auction platform, immaculate in a white suit that made him look like a successful statesman rather than a land thief. "Ah, the Holts," he said as they approached, his smile sharp as glass. "So good of you to come, considering recent misunderstandings." "Wouldn't miss it," Ruby replied sweetly. "Such a wonderful display of community spirit." Sheriff Merritt lurked nearby, his star polished bright and his hand never far from his gun. But Calder noticed something else. Many of Hargreaves' usual supporters seemed nervous. Conversations stilted. Ed Harper's defection had shaken their confidence. The afternoon wore on with forced festivities. Children played games, couples danced, and all the while, the auction block loomed like a gallows. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Hargreave climbed onto the platform. "Friends, neighbors," he began, voice carrying across the crowd. "Before we begin our auction, I want to address the vicious rumors that have been spreading. Claims about altered brands, stolen land." He shook his head sadly. "It pains me that jealousy and spite would drive some to make such accusations." Calder spotted the federal marshal near the platform, a weathered man who looked exactly like the cattle buyer he was pretending to be. The red handkerchief was visible in his breast pocket. "However," Hargreave continued, "I believe in facing lies head-on, so if anyone has actual evidence of wrongdoing, let them present it now, before all these witnesses." It was a trap, of course, but it was also exactly the opening they'd planned for. Ruby stepped forward before Calder could stop her. "I have evidence, Mr. Hargreave." A murmur ran through the crowd. Hargreaves' smile widened. "By all means, Mrs. Holt, share your evidence with us all." Ruby climbed onto the platform with calm dignity, producing her ledger. 3 years of altered brands, documented and witnessed. Shall I start with the rocking T cattle that mysteriously became Double H? Or perhaps the 17 families who lost their lands to surveying errors that all favored your holdings? "Papers can be forged," Hargreaves said dismissively. "Where's your proof?" That was Calder's cue. He stepped forward with the canvas bag of branding irons. "Right here." He climbed onto the platform and, with practiced movements, demonstrated the alteration technique on a piece of leather. The crowd pressed closer, watching as the rocking T transformed into Double H before their eyes. "This is how it's done," he said, voice carrying clearly. "This is how honest brands become lies, how neighbors' cattle become one man's wealth." The murmur grew to angry muttering. Several ranchers who'd lost cattle stepped forward, recognizing their altered brands. "Tricks," Hargreaves snarled. "Stage magic, Sheriff. Arrest these fraudsters." But before Merritt could move, a new voice rang out. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say first." A young man pushed through the crowd thin, travel-worn, but with familiar features. Ruby gasped, her ledger falling from nerveless fingers. "Noah." Her brother climbed onto the platform, and Calder saw Hargreave go pale beneath his tan. "Hello, sister," Noah said softly, then turned to face the crowd. "My name is Noah Ansel. 6 months ago, I was working as a surveyor for the railroad when I discovered systematic fraud in land claims along the route. When I tried to report it, I was attacked, beaten, and left for dead in the desert." The crowd had gone dead silent. "I survived," Noah continued, "because a band of Apache traders found me. I've spent these months recovering, gathering evidence, working with federal investigators to document the full extent of the conspiracy. And Mr. Hargreave," he smiled coldly, "we have everything, including the letters you wrote authorizing my murder." "Lies," Hargreave roared. "Sheriff, do your job." Merritt drew his gun. but not at who anyone expected. The barrel pointed straight at Ruby. Everyone stays calm, or the woman dies. Lower your weapon, Sheriff. The federal marshal had abandoned his disguise, badge now visible. James Morrison, U.S. Marshal, you're all under arrest. Like hell. Merritt's hand was steady despite the sweat on his face. We're walking out of here. Me and Mr. Hargreave. Anyone follows, she dies. Everything happened at once. Merritt grabbed for Ruby. Calder moved without thinking, stepping between them. The gun swung his way. The shot was impossibly loud in the evening air. Calder felt the bullet tear along his ribs, spinning him half around, through the shock and sudden pain. He heard Ruby scream his name, but his movement had given Marshal Morrison the opening he needed. The federal lawman's shot was true, and Merritt's gun went flying as he clutched his shoulder. In the chaos that followed, Hargreave tried to run. He made it 3 steps before the crowd of ranchers, his victims, blocked his path. There was no violence, just a wall of silent, accusing faces that held him until Morrison's deputies arrived. Calder Ruby was there, pressing something against his side, her face white with fear. Don't you dare die on me. We have a real marriage to plan. Remember? Just a scratch, he managed, though the world was spinning alarmingly. Men, she muttered, but her hands were gentle as she worked. Noah, help me get him down. Her brother appeared on his other side, surprisingly strong for his thin frame. So this is the man who protected you. This is the man I love, Ruby said firmly. And despite the pain, Calder felt warmth bloom in his chest. The next hour was a blur. Ruby and the town doctor worked over his wound, painful but not fatal, the bullet having carved a deep groove along his ribs without hitting anything vital. Around them, the barbecue had transformed into something else entirely, a reckoning. Marshal Morrison and his men were taking statements, documenting years of crimes. Hargreave, his white suit now dusty and stained, sat in shackles as witness after witness came forward. The photographer he'd hired was now documenting a very different kind of history. 20 years, Morrison said later, reviewing the evidence. That's what he's looking at, maybe more. The land fraud alone would be enough, but conspiracy to commit murder, cattle theft, bribery. He shook his head. You folks did good work here. As the stars came out over Red Hollow, Calder found himself sitting on the platform steps, Ruby beside him, her hand in his. The wound throbbed, but it was a clean pain, honest, like the town itself, hurt but healing. Your brother, he said. How? I'm hard to kill, Noah said, approaching with water for them both. Took me months to heal. More months to work with the Federals without alerting Hargreave. I'm sorry, Ruby. I wanted to contact you, but you're here now, she said simply. That's what matters. The crowd was dispersing slowly, families heading home with a different kind of hope than they'd arrived with. Tomorrow would bring challenges sorting out legitimate land claims, returning stolen cattle, rebuilding trust. But tonight, they'd won something precious, justice. So, Ruby said softly, leaning against Calder's uninjured side. What now, partner? He pressed a kiss to her temple, not caring who saw. Now we build something better, together. Together, she agreed. In the distance, someone had lit a bonfire, not of destruction this time, but of celebration. The flames rose into the night sky like a beacon, calling all of Red Hollow to witness the end of one era and the beginning of another. And in the abandoned blacksmith shop, the forges that had revealed the truth would soon ring again with honest work, as a town scarred by deception began to heal under stars that, for the first time in years, seemed to shine with promise. The first drops of rain fell just after dawn, gentle as a blessing on the parched earth of Red Hollow. Calder stood on the porch of the new schoolhouse, coffee in hand, watching the clouds gather over the mountains. 6 weeks had passed since Hargreave's arrest. 6 weeks of changes that would have seemed impossible just months before. "The children will be disappointed," Ruby said, joining him. "They were looking forward to measuring the new well site today." "Let them be disappointed by rain for once," Calder replied, pulling her close with his free arm. "Lord knows we've had enough disappointment from drought." The territorial investigation had been thorough and swift. Hargreaves' illegal empire had crumbled like a house of cards, revealing decades of fraud that stretched across 3 counties. The man himself was awaiting trial in Santa Fe, his assets frozen pending redistribution to his victims. Mrs. Holt, Mr. Calder. Young Isabella Santos came running through the rain, her mother Maria hurrying behind with an umbrella. "Is it true? Is Uncle Noah really going to drive the train?" Ruby laughed, catching the little girl as she bounded onto the porch. "Just for the celebration run? He's not a real engineer yet, just learning." Noah had taken a job with the railroad legitimately this time, using his surveying skills to help map new routes that wouldn't displace existing settlements. It was his way of making amends for the unwitting part he'd played in Hargreaves' schemes before discovering the truth. "But he promised to blow the whistle when he passes the school," Isabella insisted. "Then I'm sure he will," Calder assured her. "Your Uncle Noah keeps his promises." Maria Santos reached the porch, shaking her head fondly. "She's been up since before dawn, too excited to sleep. The whole town is buzzing about the celebration." It was true. In 2 days, Red Hollow would hold its first harvest festival as a truly free community. The territorial government had officially returned all stolen lands to their rightful owners. And the new Water Rights Committee, elected fairly with representatives from all parts of town, had ensured equitable access to the wells and irrigation. "Will you still teach the sewing class this afternoon?" Maria asked Ruby. "Despite the rain." "Of course. Rain's no excuse to stop learning." Ruby set Isabella down gently. "Besides, we're working on your wedding dress, aren't we?" Maria blushed. She was engaged to Tom Brennan, the cowboy who'd stood with them against Hargreave. It was one of several romances that had bloomed in the wake of the town's liberation, as if love itself had been waiting for justice to clear the air. After they left, Calder and Ruby made their way to the new town hall, a modest building constructed where Hargreaves' gaudy saloon had once stood. The morning's business was routine, but satisfying, reviewing applications for small business loans from the fund created by selling Hargreaves' ill-gotten assets, planning the new irrigation system, discussing the proposal for a proper medical clinic. "Hard to believe," Judge Theodore Ashford said, reviewing the documents. He was the federal appointee who'd replaced the corrupt local judge. 6 months ago, this town was dying. Now look at it. Through the window, they could see the evidence of renewal. New shops were opening. The abandoned blacksmith forge rang with honest work again. Families who'd fled were returning, drawn by news of Red Hollow's transformation. "Justice has a way of helping things grow," Ruby observed, "like rain after a drought." "Speaking of growth," the judge said with a smile, "I received an interesting letter from the Territorial Education Board. They're impressed by your school, Mrs. Holt. They're offering funding to expand it into a proper academy." Ruby's eyes widened. "Truly?" 2 teachers' salaries to start. Funds for books and supplies. They specifically mentioned your innovative approach to practical mathematics. He glanced at Calder. "I believe that was your contribution." "We're partners," Calder said simply, "in everything." That afternoon, while Ruby taught sewing and letters to a room full of eager students, Calder worked with Noah on the final survey of the communal lands. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, perfect for walking the boundaries they were marking with permanent stone monuments. "She never gave up," Noah said suddenly, driving in a survey stake. "Even when I'd been gone for months, when everyone said I was dead, Ruby kept believing." "Your sister's not one for giving up," Calder agreed. "Lucky for you." Noah grinned. "I heard about your business arrangement marriage. How long did that last before you both admitted the truth? Calder felt heat rise in his face. Longer than it should have. Well, you're making up for it now. Noah gestured toward the town. This place, these changes, it's as much your doing as hers. We all did it together. Maybe, but you two lit the match. That evening, unexpected visitors arrived at the schoolhouse. Prudence Vale stood in the doorway, rain dripping from her severe black umbrella, accompanied by several women from her former moral committee. "Mrs. Holt," she began stiffly. "Mr. Holt, we've come to... that is, I've come to..." "Would you like some tea?" Ruby offered gently. "Please, come in out of the rain." They sat awkwardly around the quilting frame Ruby had set up for the advanced sewing class. Prudence clutched her teacup like a shield. "I was wrong," she said finally, the words seeming to physically pain her. "About you. About many things. Hargreave used my committee. Used our desire for moral order to divide the town. I see that now." "We all make mistakes," Ruby said. "What matters is what we do once we see the truth." "Yes, well..." Prudence set down her cup with a sudden decision. "We've brought fabric for the festival bunting. And I thought, that is, if you'd be willing, perhaps I could help with the sewing classes." It was an olive branch wrapped in cotton and good intentions. Ruby smiled. "We'd be honored to have your help, Mrs. Vale." The next day dawned clear, the rain having washed the air clean. The transformation was remarkable. Wildflowers that had been dormant in the drought burst into bloom, painting the hills with color. It seemed all of nature was joining Red Hollow's celebration of renewal. "Riders coming," Calder observed from the porch, shading his eyes against the morning sun. But these weren't threats. They were families returning the Townsends, who'd fled when their cattle were stolen. The Jangs, whose restaurant had been burned out by Hargreave's men. Others who'd been driven away by injustice and were drawn back by hope. "Going to need more houses," Ruby said practically. "More shops, maybe even a bank that won't cheat people. Already thinking ahead. Always." She leaned into his side. "Though I've been thinking about our house too. It's getting a bit small. Don't you think?" Calder looked down at her, noting the way her hand rested on her stomach and the particular light in her eyes. Understanding dawned like sunrise. "Ruby, are you..." "Due in spring, near as I can figure." Her smile was radiant. "Seems appropriate, doesn't it? New life for a new town?" He kissed her there on the porch, in full view of the street, not caring who saw. When they broke apart, half the town seemed to be grinning at them. "About time," old Thomas called out. His hands had healed better than expected, and he'd returned to tending the wells with fierce pride. "This town needs more children who'll grow up free." The harvest festival exceeded everyone's expectations. The entire county seemed to turn out, drawn by curiosity and the promise of a fresh start. There was dancing in the streets, competitions for the children, and tables groaning with food contributed by every family. Noah kept his promise, blowing the train whistle in a jaunty pattern as he passed the school. The photographer from Hargreaves' barbecue had returned, this time to document joy instead of deception. Even nature cooperated, providing the most spectacular sunset anyone could remember. "Look at them," Ruby said that evening, watching couples dance while children chased fireflies. 6 months ago, they were afraid to speak to each other. Now they're family. Families argue sometimes. Calder warned, there'll be disputes over water rights, disagreements about land use. Human nature doesn't change overnight. "No," Ruby agreed. "But we've built something here. Systems that are fair. People who've learned to stand together instead of being divided. It's a foundation. Strong enough to build on. Strong enough to last." She took his hand, placing it over the slight swell of her stomach. "For generations." As if in agreement, the sky opened again, Not with the harsh storms of summer, but with the gentle, steady rain of autumn that would soak deep into the earth. The dancers laughed and kept dancing. Children splashed in forming puddles, and no one ran for shelter. They were too busy celebrating to mind getting wet. Later that night, as the festival wound down and families drifted home, Calder and Ruby walked the boundaries of their town one more time. Lanterns glowed in windows, soft voices carried on the night air, and somewhere a guitar played a melody of home. "No more stolen land," Ruby said softly. "No more altered brands or falsified claims. No more shadows to hide in," Calder added. "No more shame that isn't earned." They stood together in the town square, where a new monument had been erected not to any one person, but to justice itself. The inscription read simply, "Truth makes free." "What do you think?" Ruby asked. "Was it worth it, all the pain and struggle?" Calder thought of his scarred back, of her brother's months of suffering, of old Thomas's burned hands and all the families driven from their homes. Then he looked at the town around them alive, honest, whole. "Ask me in 20 years, he said finally, "when our children are measuring their own futures with the tools we taught them." Ruby laughed, the sound bright as stars. "I'll hold you to that, Mr. Holt." "I hope you do, Mrs. Holt. I truly hope you do." The rain continued to fall, gentle and steady, washing the last of the dust from Red Hollow's streets. And in the morning, when the sun rose on their transformed town, it would reveal green shoots pushing up through soil that had seemed dead but was only waiting for the right conditions to bloom. Justice, like rain, had finally come to Red Hollow, and with it, the promise of harvest for generations to come. The spring sun was gentle on Ruby's face as she stood in the doorway of their home, watching Calder work with the horses in the corral. Their daughter, little Sarah, just 3 months old, slept peacefully in the cradle Noah had crafted with his newly skilled hands. The wood bore intricate carvings of stars and mountains, symbols of guidance and strength. "You're going to wear a hole in that floor with your staring," Noah teased, coming up behind her with a cup of coffee. "Just thinking," Ruby said softly, "about how different everything is now." It had been 2 years since Hargreaves' fall, 2 years of building and growth. Red Hollow had become something none of them had dared imagine, a true community where justice wasn't just a word carved in stone, but a living, breathing practice. "Different good or different bad?" Noah asked, though his smile said he knew the answer. "Look around you." Ruby gestured to the thriving town. "The school has 40 students now. The medical clinic serves 3 counties. The water committee just approved the new irrigation plan that will double our farming capacity. I'd say different good." In the corral, Calder was working with a young Mustang, his movements patient and sure. The scar from the bullet wound was just another mark on his body now, like the brand on his back, reminders of battles fought and won. "He's teaching the Brennan boys his horse gentling methods," Noah observed. "Tom says they've never seen anything like it." "He has a gift," Ruby agreed, "for understanding creatures that have been hurt." "Wonder where he learned that," Noah said meaningfully, and Ruby smiled. The sound of approaching wagons drew their attention. Today was special, the official dedication of the new Red Hollow Community Trust, established with the last of Hargreaves' seized assets. It would provide low-interest loans for families starting businesses or farms, ensuring that never again could one man hold the town's economy hostage. "So, Mrs. Holt," Maria Brennan called out, her own baby balanced on her hip. "The ladies' committee is ready for the presentation." Ruby handed Sarah to Noah and smoothed her dress. The ladies' committee had evolved from Prudence Vale's Moral Society into something far more practical, a group that organized everything from barn raisings to emergency food supplies for families in need. As the town gathered in the square, Ruby noticed how naturally people mixed now. Mexican families stood with Anglo ranchers. Former cowboys chatted with railroad workers. Children of all backgrounds played together without thought to the divisions that had once seemed insurmountable. Judge Ashford called the meeting to order. 2 years ago, this town was dying under the weight of lies and theft. Today, we celebrate not just survival but transformation. The Red Hollow Community Trust represents our commitment to ensuring that prosperity is shared, not hoarded. Applause rippled through the crowd. Then Calder stepped forward, and Ruby's heart swelled with pride. Public speaking had never come easily to him, but he'd learned like he'd learned so many things because it mattered. "When I first came to Red Hollow," he began, his deep voice carrying across the square, "I was a man marked by injustice, branded a thief. I lived in the shadows, believing that was all I deserved." He paused, finding Ruby's eyes in the crowd. "Then I met a woman who saw past the brand to the man beneath. Together, we discovered that marks burned into flesh don't define us. Our choices do, our actions do, our willingness to stand for truth does." He pulled out a familiar object, the branding iron they'd used to expose Hargreaves' scheme. This iron was once a tool of deception. Today, we retire it forever, but we keep it as a reminder that the marks we make on this world should be ones of honesty and justice. With ceremonial gravity, he handed the iron to old Thomas, who placed it in a glass case that would rest in the town hall, a symbol not of shame, but of triumph over those who would abuse power. "Now," Judge Ashford announced with a smile, "I believe we have a wedding to celebrate." The crowd parted to reveal Tommy Martinez, now 17 and tall as a young oak, standing nervously beside Catherine Chen, the daughter of the family that had returned to open Red Hollow's first legitimate bank. Their union represented everything the new Red Hollow stood for: love crossing old boundaries, young people choosing their own futures. "You did the dress beautifully," Prudence Vale murmured to Ruby as they watched the ceremony. The older woman had become one of Ruby's most dedicated assistants in the expanded sewing school. Catherine did most of the beadwork herself. Ruby replied. She wanted to incorporate both traditions, her mother's Chinese heritage and Tommy's Mexican roots. "Beautiful," Prudence said, and there were tears in her eyes. "Simply beautiful." The wedding feast that followed filled the entire main street. Tables groaned under dishes from every culture represented in Red Hollow tamales and dumplings, cornbread and stir-fried vegetables, apple pie and Mexican wedding cookies. Noah's train had made a special run to bring in delicacies and relatives from far away. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the band struck up a waltz. Calder appeared at Ruby's elbow, Sarah cradled in one arm. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Holt?" "Always, Mr. Holt." They danced slowly, carefully, their daughter between them gurgling happily. Around them, other couples joined in: the Brennans, the Santoses, even Judge Ashford with the new schoolteacher from Denver. "Do you ever regret it?" Calder asked softly. "The simple life we could have had, just the two of us. No complications." Ruby pretended to consider. "Let's see. Instead of simple, we got a town full of extended family. Instead of quiet, we got Sarah here, who I suspect will be just as stubborn as both her parents. Instead of easy, we got meaningful." She smiled up at him. "No, Calder, I don't regret a thing." "Good," he said, spinning her gently. "Because I've been thinking about the future." "Oh." The territorial governor mentioned they're looking for honest men to help establish law in the new settlements further west. Men who understand justice and community building. Ruby raised an eyebrow. "Are you thinking of leaving Red Hollow?" "Never, but I was thinking we might help train others. Send them out with the knowledge we've gained here. Spread what we've built beyond our borders. A school for community leaders." Ruby's eyes lit up. "We could bring them here, show them how we transformed the town, teach them about fair water rights and honest surveying." "And sewing," Calder added with a grin. "Don't forget the importance of teaching practical skills to everyone, regardless of background." "I love you," Ruby said suddenly, fiercely. Have I mentioned that today? Only a dozen times or so. He kissed her forehead. Then Sarah's. But I never tire of hearing it. As the stars began to appear, first one, then dozens, then countless numbers. The photographer who had documented both Hargreaves' barbecue and the town's rebirth set up his equipment for one final shot. The entire population of Red Hollow gathered in the square, arranging themselves not by status or origin, but as neighbors, friends, family. Hold still now, the photographer called out. This one's for history. In the moment before the flash, Ruby felt Calder's hand find hers, felt the weight of Sarah in her arms, saw Noah standing proud beside them, noticed all the faces that had become dear to her, and knew that all of this was what they'd fought for. Later, as the celebration wound down and families drifted home, Calder and Ruby walked to the edge of town where the desert met the cultivated fields. The irrigation channels ran with clear water. The smell of growing things filled the air, and somewhere a mockingbird sang its borrowed songs. Look, Ruby said, pointing to Calder's back where his shirt had pulled up slightly. In the moonlight, the old brand scar was barely visible. You can hardly see it anymore. It's still there, Calder said. Always will be. Yes, Ruby agreed, tracing the mark gently with her finger. But it doesn't define you anymore. Now it's just part of your story, the chapter where everything changed. He turned to face her, cupping her face in his weathered hands. You changed everything. You saw past what they marked me as to who I could be. We saw each other, Ruby corrected. Two broken people who together made something whole. They stood there in the moonlight, holding each other and their daughter, looking out over the town they'd helped save. The transformation was complete from a place of fear and division to one of hope and unity. The physical changes were obvious: new buildings, green fields, flowing water. But the real change was deeper in hearts that had learned to trust, in hands that worked together, in voices that spoke truth without fear. What now? Ruby asked, echoing her question from that night in the canyon years ago. Now we live. Calder said simply, we raise our daughter in freedom. We teach what we've learned. We make sure this lasts. Together. Always together. A cool breeze swept across the desert, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility. In the distance, a train whistle sounded Noah bringing the last load of celebrating relatives home. The sound that had once meant danger and exploitation now meant connection and honest commerce. As they walked back toward town, Sarah began to fuss. Ruby sang softly, a lullaby that mixed Cherokee words her grandmother had taught her with the Methodist hymns of Calder's childhood. Their daughter settled, soothed by the blending of traditions that was her birthright. The main street was quiet now, but lights still glowed in windows. In the schoolhouse, someone was practicing letters by lamplight. In the clinic, the doctor was tending a late patient. In the church, the pastor was preparing tomorrow's sermon on renewal. Life went on, ordinary and extraordinary at once. Home? Calder asked. Home, Ruby agreed. They walked hand in hand through the streets of Red Hollow, past the monument to justice, past the school where children learned without fear, past the wells that flowed for all. Behind them, their shadows stretched long in the moonlight. Not dark reminders of shame, but simple evidence of two people standing in the light. And in the morning, when dawn touched the mountains and set the desert blooming, they would rise to face another day of building, teaching, and living. The brand that had once marked Calder as outcast had become something else entirely, a reminder that even the deepest scars can be transformed by love, justice, and the courage to stand for both. Red Hollow slept peacefully under stars that witnessed its transformation. A town reborn, a people united, a future bright with promise. The sweetest bride and the branded man had lit a fire that would burn for generations, not destructive, but warming, illuminating the path for all who would come after. In the end, that was their true mark upon the world, not a scar burned in flesh, but a community forged in truth. And it would endure, as all things built on justice and love endure, long after the last echo of their footsteps faded into history. Their story was complete, but Red Hollow's story, the story of what free people could build together, had only just begun. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, justice, and redemption in the Old West. I hope Calder and Ruby's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Where are you listening from today? Please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts about their story and connect with fellow Western romance lovers from around the world. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more stories of courage and love against the backdrop of the American frontier. Don't forget to hit that like button and press the hype button to help more people discover this story. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward the sunset.